the focus of much of our life is supposed to be with God's people. And we really need to care for each other and lift each other up. We need to have an alternative community here. Hi, welcome to our YouTube channel here at Mundelein Church of the Nazarene, and this is episode 12 of our ongoing series called The First Book. It is the first book because we're going through the New Testament book of Galatians. It's in the middle of the New Testament, but chronologically it's actually the first book written. Think around 48 AD. The Gospels were written, the first one, Mark, maybe somewhere around 60, maybe late 50s. So this is at least a full decade before even the earliest gospel. This is also the very last installment of this series. We've been going through the book of Galatians. And this key discussion about who is part of the family of God. On one side you have Paul, who says anyone who has faith is part of the family of God. The other side, his opponents, are saying faith is important. They weren't disagreeing. However, that faith must also have circumcision and a host of other Jewish laws. Paul's response is, if you say Christianity is faith plus anything, it ceases to be Christianity. You can be good, you can be zealous, you can be moral, you can be committed, but as soon as the basis of your faith is anything less than the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it ceases to be our unique faith. Now, Paul is writing a letter, or some people think he's given a speech here. Either way, the end of both these things, there's something called the paranesis. And that is, in light of everything that I've said, here's how you should live. And this is the section we get to in chapter 6. In light of everything, and I think Paul's going back to as much as in chapter 2, we are justified not by observing the works of the law, but we are justified by faith. And then in chapter 5, when he talks about life by the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, gentleness, kindness, and self-control. In light of these two things, plus a whole host of other things, including that long section, chapter 4, about living in the Spirit, here's where we get to chapter 6. And I know that some of us have grown up in a time and a place and maybe a situation where there were people that said, if you are a Christian, your very ability or your very desire to do anything sinful will be taken away. Now, some of those people might be well-meaning, but some of those people, I think, are just wrong. And Paul recognizes this. So he says this, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore them gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Now, there's a couple good standards here. The first one is we live in a time, and we live in the middle of cancel culture where nothing is done gently. People are digging through records. If you said something 20 years ago, if your great-grandfather said something 150 years ago, they want to disqualify you from having any role in society. This is dangerous, dangerous time. We have people furthering such an idea. Paul is on the other end of this. When someone strays, when someone does something that they shouldn't, when something happens, it's our job in the church to restore them gently. But he has a warning. Or you too may be caught in whatever they were caught in. I think sometimes the most dangerous times for a Christian is not when they feel like the temptation is near, but when we get to the point where we think we're invulnerable. And when we get invulnerable, maybe a couple things happen. The first thing that happens is we get to the point where we think there's no danger for us. And so we begin to just maybe let a little bit of sloppiness, a little bit of laziness in a little bit at a time. No Christian goes from being in a wonderful situation to robbing a liquor store overnight. That's never the danger point. The danger point is in some area of life where what we are doing is not a bad thing, but it takes our minds off of Christ. And so it could be a hobby. It could be a sport. It could be anything. It's not bad in and of itself. It's just we've replaced Jesus Christ with some other good thing. And he says, carry each other's burdens, and in such way you will fulfill the law of Christ. One of the privileges that we get to do in life is to ease the load of somebody else. And so all of us should be looking to ease that load. A number of years ago, my son was on a high school baseball team, and he had looked forward to this season for a long, long time. And he got about a month or into the season, things were starting to look up for him, and all of a sudden he had a day that just, he didn't feel right. He went into the doctor, and he had mono. And one of the things he couldn't do, he couldn't play for 4 weeks. And that was so incredibly difficult. The kid that looked forward to that season for the previous year, and then have 4 weeks where he wasn't able to play. And I remember there's a couple times in there, I said to Adam, now what time you play tomorrow, and where's the game? And he said, Dad, why are you going? You know I'm not going to play. And I said, that really doesn't have anything to do with whether I go or not. What you go through, I go through with you. I don't know that it had made a lot of difference, but we go through things with people. We help carry their load. That is one of the privileges we have as Christians. Just moving down just a little bit. There's something in verse 9. Paul says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. Now, let me just say, there's about 3 things in here I want to talk about. The first one is this. Sometimes we grew up in a church that says, you are saved by faith, not by good works. Why are you trying to do good works? You can't earn your way into eternal life. As I stated a couple weeks ago, that is not what Paul's dealing with at all. There is no one in the first century that ever had the thought that they earned their way into the family of God, even Jews. They were chosen. They had nothing to do with that. So here's Paul saying there's an expectation that God's people will do good. Not to earn our way in or not to think we qualify, but that's what we're here to do. Our job is to be sources of light and grace and peace. And the second thing is, it says, especially to the family of believers. Sometimes we just kind of go to church and we rush out. The focus of much of our life is supposed to be with God's people. And we really need to care for each other and lift each other up. We need to have an alternative community here. And we need to have this community be starkly different than the mess we see out in the world. And one way we do that is by doing good amongst each other. So therefore, our main goal in life, we are to be just examples and people who do good. Now let me say one last thing. Paul ends in verse 11. There's this interesting verse that most people don't pick up on. Paul writes and he says, see what large letters I use as I write with my own hand. Now, I'm one who will tell you something. I think Paul, on that day in Damascus Road, he was struck down, he was blinded. Some of his sight was restored, but I think Paul never fully got 100% of his sight back. This is one of the reasons why. Paul says, look, you know it's me. I'm writing. You can tell it's me. Look how large the letters I'm using. And I think it's large because it helped him see what he's writing. It was larger than the other people. In other places, he says, 3 times I cried out to the Lord to ask him to take away this thorn in my flesh. I think one of the things he's talking about, he never was quite physically what he was before this whole thing happened. There's hints in Corinthians as well. I'm not impressive outwardly, not like Apollos. I think Paul was well aware of his physical limitations. But he says, in my weakness, in my limitations, that's where Christ is is made known. Paul was aware of sometimes things in life happen and we don't get better. They're burdens we carry. Sometimes in the church we have this expectation that if we just pray enough we'll get better or something will be fixed. And that's just not the reality. And it wasn't the reality for Paul. Paul was dealing with things for the rest of his life. And he says one other thing, one last warning. He goes, be careful. Those who want to make a good impression outwardly, these people who emphasize everything on the outside, are really trying to compel you, force you to be circumcised. And the only reason they do this is to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. Not even those who are circumcised obey the law, yet they want you to be circumcised that they may boast about it. One last warning. Paul's at the end of his letter. He goes, look, it's me. I'm not speaking through anybody else. This is one last warning I give you. Be careful of the people that try to force you to be like them. I'd like to leave that thought with everybody. God has called you because you are valuable. You bring something to the table that no one else does. There are talents, there are abilities, there are people that you can reach that the most talented, the person that you think has everything going for them can't. Don't try to be like anybody else. God has called you. Sometimes, if I'm at a place where there's a big crowd, I like to look at people and kind of guess their story and where they are in life and kind of what they do for a living just by how they carry themselves, how they're dressed, some of those other hints. There's a lot of people who will put a lot of energy into getting you to look like, be like, just like them, because then it makes them feel better about themselves. That's not your battle. Paul wants you to know that's not your battle. God called you. So finally he kind of ends it and he says this: neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is being a new creation. If you've been around the church since you've been a kid or relatively new, none of that counts. Are you new right now? Are you Jew or are you Gentile? None of that counts. Only where you are right now. Were you from a rich family or poor family? None of that counts. It's where you are in Christ right now. Finally, let no one cause me trouble because I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. Paul says, look, no one's put more into this than me. I literally have the scars to prove it. This is Paul's kind of most personal plea to the church in Galatia. He's lived it, and the last thing he wants is a church that's divided by class, by race, by experience level, by anything. And he says, look, I have the scars, I have the diminished eyesight, and I have the experience to be able to say it. Maybe we'd be good to heed Paul's advice and how we live our Christian life now. I hope you've enjoyed the book of Galatians. It's the first one. That's why we did it. We'll maybe do something like this in the future. We have other series out there. I encourage you to look at them. Subscribe to our channel. Like us. And please send us a message. We'd love to answer you with another video or maybe at least talk about your question. But feel free to join us back as we add more content weekly. We'll see you again soon.